So the disciples are saying, the assumption there is that if somebody is blind or lame or sick, that it must be the result of their sin. So they're, and which is the same as Job. The people came to Job. They say, "Hey, you're going through all of this. You must have sinned." So the assumption, so it's not, and so Jesus is saying that in this case, so it's not necessary. So that could be the case, but Jesus is saying in this, but there also the dilemma is that kind of makes sense if you're 5, you're 10, you're 20, and something happens, you've sinned. They said, but this man was born blind. It's like he didn't have time to sin.
Yep.
So they're saying, okay, well, was it him that sinned or of his parents? So they say, okay, maybe his parents must have sinned, and he got his parents' sin. And so they're thinking, okay, he couldn't have been able to sin. He didn't sin in the womb, I'm sure. But then Jesus says, well, it wasn't either. It wasn't his sin or his parents' sin. Oh, wait a minute. So Jesus is explaining that it wasn't because he sinned. So they're saying, hey, this guy, something's wrong with him. There's lame, there's ailment, there's sickness. It must be because of sin. And Jesus is saying, it's not. Like, this man is blind for the glory of God to be displayed. And so it wasn't, and then he was going to cause a miracle. He later caused the man to be able to see. So the sin wasn't because the man sinned. It wasn't because his parents sinned. So it wasn't the result of sin. It was to show the glory of God. So it's to show the glory of God. So all sicknesses aren't necessarily result of sin. So now we see there are two types of sicknesses or diseases. There's a type of disease that's caused by sin, where the forgiveness of your sins will cure it, and maybe it's, could be the sin of Adam, but it's sin in general. But then we see there's a type of sin that's just for God's glory. And so disease is caused by sin. The healing's through forgiveness of sin, and the healing has to do with your faith. So if it's a disease that's done for God's glory, so we don't know if this blind man even knew who Jesus was. We don't know if this blind man even wanted to be healed. It never says the blind man wanted to be healed, but Jesus was able to heal him, and it didn't necessarily necessitate his faith because it was for God's glory. So if it's a situation where God decides that he wants to use that to get glory, it's not even, the person doesn't necessarily have to have faith. The person doesn't have to have faith. And so but then the corollary of that is that, like we saw in the story of Job lost his land. Job didn't get boils, but he got sickness on him. But it wasn't because he did something wrong. He was righteous. So that means that your sickness isn't necessarily caused by your sin. It's not necessarily because you did something wrong. A lot of people, when they get sick, they feel it's because they did something against God, or God is punishing them, and that's not necessarily the case. And if you look at the example of Job, so you may not be sick because you're out of God's will. Job was sick because he was in God's will. So you might be sick because you're in God's will, so God can use it as an example. So if you're in God's will, then you're saying, God, I want your will to be done. You're opening yourself to be used by God for his will to be done.
Job was submitted to God.
So if you submit to God, then you're submitting for him to use you in any way he seems fit. So which may be sickness, which may be healing you, which may be not healing you, depending on whichever will get him the glory. So it's not necessarily a result of your sin, or a result of so a lot of people feel the guilt, when they do something, or if their child is sick or something, they think, oh, I must have done something wrong, but it's not necessarily the case. So in conclusion, so we know that we're susceptible to sickness and disease because of Adam's fall. When Jesus and the apostles healed, the result was that God got the glory. Their signs and miracles were intended to prove that Jesus was the Messiah. It wasn't about them or about the person who got healed. So if your goal is that God gets the glory, the question is, how will God get the most glory? And a couple things that came to my mind during this, when I was preparing this lesson, is so both my father and my mother had passed, and when my father passed, my brother was working at Paramount. He was working at Paramount, and so he was in the legal department, a clerk. So he would need signatures from a lot of executives. So he knew a lot of people, some high up and everything, and so a lot of them came to support my brother at my father's funeral. So a lot of them were atheists and never, so it would be good if I could say, oh, they went back and they started writing movies for Christ after. But that's not that's not what happened. But what did happen is that so it was a celebration of life. We grew up in a Baptist church, so it was a Baptist preacher, really good preacher, who gave a sermon. It was a celebration of life, so it wasn't a sad funeral. We had a choir. It was a happy funeral, and so some of them after the funeral told my brother, they were like, I'm really sad that your father passed. They said, but I have to say that was the best church the best church thing I've ever seen. And they were really, a lot of them were really like, they would never have been in the church otherwise, and they were really touched by the service, and so it was used to touch a lot of people. And then I remember also when my mother had passed, the church I grew up in, we had been through a split, which was actually more contentious than the split that happened here. It was more contentious and more public than the split that happened here. And my mother was well known and well liked in the church. So at the church, a lot of people came together that they weren't talking anymore, or they weren't associating anymore at my mother's funeral. And it was, and I got to see, thinking about that could have been part of that. It was used for God's glory. Mm-hmm. It was used for God's glory, and so the healing may not come, but it can still be used for God's glory. Yeah. And then you talked about your example as well. So sometimes the healing may come, or you may go through the suffering in order to be an example for someone else. Mm-hmm. So you may not get healed, but you may be an example for someone else.